The envelope arrived without a return address. Inside was a wedding invitation with my daughter's name printed in elegant gold, beside a man I had never met. There was no note, no handwritten message, no explanation for why every relative I knew had already heard the news while I was learning about it from a piece of expensive paper. When I called, my voice stayed calm. She answered with a silence that felt rehearsed. Then she said something I still hear every time I close my eyes. "You don't need to come." A week later, she called again, not to apologize, not to explain. She wanted one thing. She wanted me to pay for her honeymoon in Dubai. She believed I would say yes. She had no idea what I had quietly discovered long before that phone call. Most of the time, it begins inside ordinary days that look exactly like every other day. That was my life. Quiet, predictable. I woke before sunrise every morning, not because I had to anymore, but because decades of routine never really leave you. I made coffee the same way I always had. I watered the small garden behind my house. I read the newspaper from beginning to end, even though most of the headlines only reminded me how quickly the world seemed to move without asking anyone's permission. My neighbors called me dependable. My coworkers used to call me patient. My daughter used to call me dad. Those three words had always mattered more than any title I had ever earned. I raised her believing that love was something you proved through consistency, not speeches. I was never the loud parent. I was never the one who demanded appreciation. If she needed help moving apartments, I arrived before the movers. If her car broke down, I drove across town without mentioning the inconvenience. When tuition bills appeared that she couldn't manage alone, I found a way to make them disappear before she had the chance to panic. I never kept receipts. Not because I forgot, because I never imagined I would need them. Children are not investments. You do not help them expecting interest in return. You simply help because they are yours. After her mother passed away, that belief became even stronger. There were years when I questioned every decision I made. Was I too strict, too gentle? Did I protect her enough? Did I prepare her for the world? Every parent carries those questions like invisible weight. You never really put them down. As she grew older, our conversations naturally changed. They became shorter, less frequent, more practical. Instead of telling me every detail about her day, she called when she needed advice about insurance, taxes, apartments, or jobs. That never bothered me. Life changes people. Adults become busy. I understood that. Or at least I believed I did. When she told me she had met someone special, I smiled before she finished the sentence. I wanted her to build a life larger than the one I had been able to give her. She sounded happy. That was enough for me. The first time I met her fiancé, he was polite, almost carefully polite. He shook my hand firmly, maintained eye contact, complimented the house, asked thoughtful questions. Nothing about him immediately raised concern. If anything, I wondered whether I had been too cautious. Perhaps my protective instincts were simply adjusting to the idea that another man would become part of my daughter's life. I reminded myself that fathers are supposed to let go little by little. That is how families grow. Over the following months, our conversations became less spontaneous. Instead of calling just to talk, she usually texted. Instead of visiting alone, she almost always came with him. Again, I found nothing unusual about it. Young couples build routines together. That is what people do. Sometimes weeks passed without hearing her voice. Then a message would arrive. "Busy week. We're traveling. Work has been exhausting." I answered every message the same way. "No problem. Take care. Proud of you." I never wanted her to feel guilty for living her own life. Looking back now, I wonder whether my silence made it easier for everyone else to mistake acceptance for blindness. There were family dinners where conversations paused for a fraction of a second after I entered the room. Someone would quickly change the subject. Someone else would smile a little too brightly. Then everything continued as though nothing had happened. I noticed those moments. I simply chose not to assign meaning to them. Trust often looks like ignoring questions you could easily ask. Birthdays came. Holidays passed. She still hugged me before leaving. She still thanked me for every meal. She still called me Dad. Nothing appeared broken, only different, and different does not always mean dangerous. Around that time, she mentioned they were thinking about getting married, not with excitement, more like a casual update slipped into another conversation. "We've started talking about weddings," I smiled. "Whenever the day comes, I'll be there," she smiled back. I know. It was a simple exchange, so ordinary that I never imagined I would replay it in my mind hundreds of times. Because I believed those 3 words. I know, I assumed they meant there would be planning together, conversations, questions, perhaps disagreements over flowers or venues or guest lists, not because I wanted control, because fathers usually stand somewhere inside those memories, even quietly, especially quietly. As the months passed, I continued living exactly as I always had. I worked around the house, visited old friends, paid my bills, answered every call she made. Never asked why she hadn't called sooner, never complained about the growing distance. Love, I believed, was patient enough to survive silence. I had no reason to think otherwise, at least not yet, because while I was protecting our relationship by refusing to question it, someone else had already begun rewriting my place inside it. If someone had asked me then whether anything was wrong, I would have said no. Not because everything felt right, because nothing felt serious enough to explain. That is how quiet betrayal survives. It hides inside moments that are easy to excuse. A few days after our conversation about the wedding, I called my daughter during my lunch break. The phone rang longer than usual. When she answered, her voice sounded distracted. "Hi, Dad. I hope I'm not interrupting." "No, we're just busy." There was movement in the background. Several people were talking. Someone laughed. I thought I heard music. Before I could ask what they were doing, she lowered her voice. "I'll call you later." She never did. The next morning, I sent a simple message. "Hope everything is going well." She replied 6 hours later. "Everything's fine. Nothing more. No photograph. No story. No question about how I was doing." I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Then I placed the phone back in my pocket. People become busy. That was still the explanation I preferred. A week later, I attended my niece's birthday dinner. Family gatherings had always been loud. Children running through the house, several conversations happening at once, the smell of food filling every room. It was comforting because it never changed until that evening. I had barely sat down when my cousin smiled at me. "So, have you decided what you'll wear?" I looked at him. "For what?" He laughed politely. "The wedding." Before I answered, his wife gently touched his arm. He stopped smiling. "Oh." The room became strangely quiet for a second. Then someone asked another question about dessert, and the conversation moved on as if nothing unusual had happened. But something had happened, not something obvious, just enough to leave a question behind. How did everyone seem to know more than I did? On the drive home, I convinced myself there was a reasonable explanation. Perhaps invitations had not been finalized. Perhaps people were only guessing. Perhaps I had misunderstood. I slept poorly that night, not because I was angry. Because uncertainty is exhausting. A few days later, my sister called. We talked about ordinary things, her garden, her grandchildren, the weather. Then she paused. "I assume you've already seen the venue." "The venue?" Another silence. "The place they booked." "No, I thought." She stopped herself. "It's probably meant to be a surprise." She changed the subject immediately. I let her. After we hung up, I remained sitting in my chair long after the television had gone dark. I replayed every word. Not because she had lied, because she had accidentally revealed that everyone believed I already knew things I had never been told. That realization stayed with me. Still, I refused to confront my daughter. I did not want to become the father who demanded explanations for every misunderstanding. Trust deserves patience, at least once. When she finally called a few days later, I listened more than I spoke. She sounded cheerful. She mentioned work, traffic, weekend plans, nothing about the wedding. I waited. Eventually I asked, as casually as I could, "So, how's the planning going?" There was a brief pause. "It's stressful." "I can imagine. We're keeping it simple. I'm sure it'll be beautiful." "Thanks." The conversation drifted somewhere else. No details, no excitement, no questions about whether I wanted to help. When the call ended, I realized something that unsettled me more than silence itself. She had spoken about the wedding as though I were any other acquaintance, not her father. Just someone receiving a polite update. The following weekend, I stopped by a local hardware store. As I waited to pay, I heard someone call my name. It was an old family friend. We exchanged the usual greetings. Then he smiled warmly. "You must be excited." "I am," he laughed. "Walking your daughter down the aisle." I smiled back. "I hope so." His expression changed almost immediately. "You haven't talked about it." "We've both been busy." He nodded slowly. "I suppose these young people like keeping surprises." There was kindness in his voice, but there was also uncertainty, as though he had accidentally stepped into a conversation he should not have started. Driving home, I noticed how often I was defending situations no one had actually accused me of misunderstanding. Every uncomfortable moment received the same explanation. "They're busy. They're tired. They're overwhelmed." I repeated those words so often they almost became comforting. Yet another thought had begun quietly forming beneath them. If everyone believed I was involved, why was no one involving me? The answer still felt impossible, so I refused to consider it. Instead, I continued exactly as I always had. I answered every message, returned every missed call, never asked difficult questions, never allowed disappointment to become visible. Because once doubt enters a relationship, every conversation changes, and I was not ready for that. Not yet. I still believed whatever was happening could be explained. I simply did not know that explanations become much harder to believe when they begin arriving too late. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. There was nothing remarkable about the envelope itself. Heavy cream-colored paper. My name printed neatly across the front. A return address I recognized. Anyone watching me collect the mail would have thought it was just another ordinary afternoon. I carried it inside with the rest of the letters and placed everything on the kitchen table. I made coffee first. Old habits have a way of slowing moments that later become impossible to forget. Only after sitting down did I open it. Inside was a beautiful invitation, elegant lettering, a carefully chosen venue, a date only 6 weeks away. Every detail suggested months of planning, months. I read it twice, then a third time, not because I had missed something, because I was searching for what wasn't there. No handwritten note, no message from my daughter, no explanation for why I was learning about one of the most important days of her life at exactly the same moment as distant relatives and old family friends. I looked at the date again, 6 weeks. That meant the venue had been booked long ago. The guest list had already been finalized. Decisions had been made. Conversations had happened. Plans had been built. And somehow, through all of it, no one had thought to include me. I placed the invitation back into its envelope with unusual care, not because I wanted to protect it, because my hands had begun to shake just enough for me to notice. That evening, I called my daughter. She answered after several rings. "Hi, Dad. I received the invitation today." "Oh, good." Her voice carried relief instead of excitement. I ignored it. "It looks beautiful. Thank you." I didn't realize everything was already arranged. "We've been busy." "I'm sure you have." There was a pause. I waited. Surely she would say something else, perhaps apologize for not keeping me updated, perhaps explain that everything had happened faster than expected. Instead, she asked, "So, what do you think of the venue?" Not why I had been left out, not whether I was hurt, just the venue. "It looks lovely," I replied. "I'm glad you like it." That was the end of the conversation. When we hung up, I sat in silence for nearly an hour. Not because I had answers, because I had too many questions. A few days later, my cousin invited me for coffee. He had always been the sort of man who spoke before carefully considering whether he should. Halfway through our conversation, he frowned. I was surprised. "About what?" "I heard you didn't want to be involved." I stared at him. "I'm sorry." He shifted uncomfortably. "I shouldn't have said anything." "No." I kept my voice calm. "Please finish." He looked down at his cup. Someone mentioned that you wanted to stay out of the planning. They said you preferred to keep your distance. I never said that. I didn't think it sounded like you. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. He finally sighed. I assumed it was a private family decision. So did I. Those 4 words lingered between us. On the drive home, I realized something had changed. Until then, I believed I had simply been overlooked. Now another possibility had appeared. Someone had not only excluded me, someone had explained my absence without asking me, without telling me. The following weekend, I began organizing old paperwork in my home office. It was something I often did when I needed to think: bills, insurance documents, tax records, receipts. As I sorted through folders, I came across bank transfers from the previous year. One payment caught my attention. It was for the engagement celebration. My daughter had called months earlier, embarrassed about unexpected costs. She had promised it would only cover a small portion. I transferred the money that same afternoon. Looking through family photographs posted online, I noticed several relatives publicly thanking another family member for helping make the celebration possible. No one knew I had quietly paid most of the bill. I had never corrected anyone. Recognition had never mattered. But now the pattern felt different. Invisible support, invisible father. The thought unsettled me. A few days later, my sister visited unexpectedly. She brought homemade bread, as she often did. We talked about ordinary things until she hesitated. I probably shouldn't mention this. I looked at her. What is it? I overheard your daughter's fiancé talking after dinner last month. I remained silent. He said it was easier if too many opinions weren't involved. What opinions? He mentioned you. She watched my face carefully. He said older people sometimes make weddings complicated. I almost smiled, not because it was amusing, because it was strangely familiar. The statement sounded reasonable, respectful even, until I realized it had become a convenient excuse for excluding me entirely. I see, I said quietly. I'm sorry. So am I. That night, I walked through every room of my house before going to bed. The photographs on the walls suddenly looked different. Birthdays, school graduations, family vacations, years filled with ordinary happiness. Nothing inside those pictures hinted that one day I would become a stranger to decisions involving my own child. Still, I resisted anger. Anger demands certainty. I did not have certainty, only contradictions. People believed I chose distance. I had never chosen it. People believed I knew the plans. I knew almost nothing. People believed everything was normal. Nothing about it felt normal anymore. For the first time, I stopped asking whether I was imagining things. Instead, I began asking a quieter question: if this misunderstanding had been accidental. Why did every explanation seem to protect everyone except me? That question stayed with me long after the lights were off, and for the first time since the invitation arrived. I stopped waiting for the truth to come to me. I decided I would quietly begin looking for it. The hardest part was not being excluded. It was being made to feel as though I had imagined it. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from questioning your own memory. You begin replaying conversations, reading old messages again, wondering whether you overlooked something obvious, whether you had somehow created the distance yourself. For several days, I said nothing, not because I had given up, because I wanted one honest conversation before reaching any conclusions. When my daughter finally called, I asked if we could meet for coffee. She agreed without hesitation. That gave me hope. People who are hiding something usually avoid quiet conversations, or so I believed. We met at a small cafe we had visited many times over the years. She arrived a few minutes late. She smiled. She hugged me. For a brief moment, everything felt familiar. Then we sat down. I waited until the drinks arrived before speaking. I've been thinking about the wedding. She nodded. I figured you might. I just want to understand something. Okay? I've heard several people mention plans they assumed I already knew. She looked down at her cup. So, I don't understand why everyone thinks I've been involved. Her expression changed almost instantly, not to guilt, not to concern, to frustration. Dad, she sighed softly, you're overthinking this. I remained quiet. We've just been busy. I understand. There isn't some secret. I didn't say there was. She leaned back in her chair. I think you're reading too much into ordinary things. Her words were calm, measured, reasonable. That made them harder to challenge because they sounded like reassurance, yet they left every question unanswered. I was only hoping to understand. You already do. No, I smiled politely. I don't. She looked toward the window before answering. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be. That sentence stayed with me long after we left. Not because it explained anything, because it subtly suggested that the problem existed inside me, not inside the situation. When we stood to leave, she hugged me again. I love you. I love you too. Neither of us mentioned the wedding again. Driving home, I realized something uncomfortable. The conversation had lasted nearly an hour. We had discussed everything except the one question I had asked. A week later, another opportunity came unexpectedly. A family dinner at my brother's house. The engagement was naturally the center of conversation. Guests spoke about flowers, music, travel arrangements, hotel reservations. I listened more than I spoke. Then someone asked, so who handled the guest list? Before my daughter answered, her fiancé smiled. It became complicated. He laughed lightly. Families always have opinions. Several people smiled. He continued. We decided it would be easier if we kept the planning team small. His eyes briefly met mine, only for a second, but long enough for me to notice. Someone asked, did her father mind? He answered before I could. He's never really enjoyed that sort of thing. A few heads nodded. The conversation moved forward. I remained silent, because what he had said wasn't completely false. I did dislike unnecessary attention. Large celebrations exhausted me. But that was never the same as refusing to be included. He had taken one true detail and quietly reshaped it into something entirely different. It was skillfully done, no obvious lie, just a carefully edited version of reality. After dinner, my sister walked beside me toward the driveway. You were very quiet. I was listening. You could have corrected him. I could have. Why didn't you? I looked back toward the house. Because people rarely change their minds in front of an audience. She nodded slowly. I suppose you're right. No, I answered honestly. I just don't want to become another argument. The following week brought another conversation, this time with my daughter alone. She had called to discuss an unrelated family matter. Before ending the call, I spoke carefully. I've been thinking about what your fiancé said. What about it? He told everyone I didn't want to be involved. She was silent, then she laughed quietly. Dad, that's not what he meant. What did he mean? You know how you are. I waited. You've always preferred staying in the background. I've preferred avoiding attention. Exactly. Those aren't the same thing. Another pause, then came the sentence that changed something inside me. I think you're remembering things differently than everyone else. I closed my eyes, not because I was angry, because I suddenly understood what was happening. The facts were no longer being discussed. My memory was, my intentions were, my personality was. Every conversation quietly returned to the same conclusion. If something felt wrong, it was because I misunderstood. If people believed I had chosen distance, perhaps I had accidentally given that impression. If I felt hurt, perhaps I was simply too sensitive. There was always another explanation, one that required everyone else to be reasonable and only me to be mistaken. After we ended the call, I opened an old box in my study. Inside were birthday cards, school drawings, letters my daughter had written as a child. One small note caught my attention. It read, "Thank you for always showing up, Dad." I held it for a long time, not because it proved anything to anyone else, because it reminded me that I knew who I had been. That mattered. Gaslighting does not always make you believe lies. Sometimes it simply makes you distrust truths you already know. I refused to let that happen. I did not argue. I did not accuse anyone. Instead, I began doing something I should have done much earlier. I stopped relying on conversations, and I started relying on facts, messages, dates, receipts. Emails, not to win an argument, but to protect my own memory, because if everyone insisted, I had imagined the betrayal. Then only the quiet record of what had actually happened could tell me whether I still recognized the truth. And deep down, I already suspected what those records were going to reveal. I never set out to prove anyone wrong. I only wanted to understand what had happened. That difference mattered to me. If I had gone looking for someone to blame, I would have seen guilt everywhere. Every delayed reply would have felt intentional. Every forgotten conversation would have become evidence. Instead, I started with something much simpler. I made a timeline. A yellow legal pad sat on my dining room table. On one side, I wrote every conversation I could remember about the wedding. On the other, I listed dates from emails, text messages, calendar entries, and bank statements. It felt almost unnecessary at first. Surely I was overreacting. Surely the pieces would fit together once I saw them in order. Instead, they drifted farther apart. According to the invitation, the venue had been reserved nearly 9 months earlier. 9 months. During those same months, my daughter and I had spoken dozens of times. Birthdays, holiday dinners, phone calls, coffee together. Not once had she mentioned visiting the venue. Not once had she asked my opinion. Not once had she even hinted that decisions had already been made. I stared at the dates for a long time. It is difficult to call something an oversight when it lasts nearly a year. A few days later, my sister called. "I need to ask you something." "Of course. Were you ever invited to the tasting?" "The tasting," she hesitated. "The menu tasting." I smiled to myself, though there was no humor in it. "No, I thought maybe you couldn't make it. I didn't know it happened." She became quiet. "I shouldn't have assumed." "No," I answered gently. "None of us should have." That conversation ended quickly, but it left another mark on my timeline. Menu tasting, another event, another decision, another room I had never entered. The following week, I received an unexpected call from a woman introducing herself as the wedding planner. For a moment, I assumed she had the wrong number. "Mr. Harrison?" "Yes." "I'm sorry to bother you. I'm calling because there seems to be some confusion regarding the final payment schedule. I think you've mistaken me for someone else." She paused. "I was told you were handling the remaining balance." I felt my grip tighten around the phone. "I wasn't aware of that." "Oh," her voice immediately changed. "I'm terribly sorry." She sounded genuinely uncomfortable. "I shouldn't have called." Before she could end the conversation, I asked one quiet question. "When were you told that?" She hesitated. "Several months ago." Several months, not days, not weeks, months. Someone had expected me to pay long before I even knew how little I had been included. "I appreciate you letting me know. I'm very sorry." "So am I." After we hung up, I did not feel angry. I felt strangely calm. For the first time, something had not come from family assumptions or overheard conversations. It had come from someone with no reason to protect anyone. A professional. Someone simply following payment records. That mattered. I added another line to the timeline, expected to pay, not expected to participate. The contrast was impossible to ignore. 2 evenings later, my cousin stopped by unexpectedly. He carried an old photo album he had borrowed months before. After placing it on the table, he looked at me carefully. "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "I believed what people were saying." "What were they saying?" "That you wanted distance." I remained silent. He continued, "Last weekend I spoke with your daughter's maid of honor." "What did she say?" "She assumed you had refused every invitation." "I never received one." "I know." His voice dropped. "She didn't." We sat quietly. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence. Finally, he said, "She told me your daughter kept saying you weren't interested in planning because weddings weren't your kind of thing." I nodded slowly. "I've heard something similar." I believed it. "I don't blame you." He looked surprised. "You don't know. Why not?" "Because the story made sense." He frowned. "But it wasn't true." "No, it wasn't." He shook his head. "I'm sorry." His apology felt different from the conversations I had been having for weeks. There was no excuse, no attempt to soften the facts, just recognition. Sometimes that is enough. The real turning point came 3 days later. My phone rang just after dinner. It was my daughter. She sounded unusually cheerful. "Dad, are you busy?" "Not at all. I wanted to ask you something." "Go ahead." She hesitated just long enough to sound nervous. "We've been looking at honeymoon packages." "That sounds exciting." "It is." Another pause. "There's just one problem." I already knew where the conversation was heading. "Our budget came up short." I waited. "We were hoping," she inhaled quietly, "that maybe you could help us with Dubai." The word hung in the air. Dubai, not the wedding, not repairing our relationship, not explaining months of silence. Dubai, she continued speaking. Flights, hotels, experiences. It sounded less like a request and more like a presentation prepared in advance. When she finally stopped, I asked only one question. "Can I ask you something first?" "Sure." "When did you decide I would be paying for this?" Silence, a long one. We just thought." "You thought what?" "That you'd want to help." "I always have." Another silence. "Then, I also thought I would be part of my daughter's wedding." She did not answer. Neither did I. Several seconds passed. Finally, she spoke. "You're making this about the wedding again." "No," I said quietly. "I think the wedding has already made this about itself." She ended the call a few moments later, saying she needed time to think. I never raised my voice. I never accused her of lying. I simply asked a question no one had prepared to answer. That night, I looked once more at the timeline spread across my dining room table. Dates, messages, payments, witnesses, conversations. Individually, each one could still be explained away. Together, they told a story that no longer depended on my feelings. It depended on facts, and facts have a quiet way of surviving every version of the truth people try to invent. For the first time since the invitation had arrived, I stopped wondering whether I had been excluded. I knew I had. The only question left was how far everyone would go to pretend otherwise. After that phone call, the silence lasted 4 days. Not the ordinary kind of silence that comes from busy schedules or missed calls. This one felt deliberate. My daughter did not text. She did not call. The messages I sent were simple. "I hope you're doing well. Let me know when you'd like to talk." Neither received a reply. Years earlier, that silence would have frightened me. Now it simply confirmed that the conversation had reached a place no one had expected. I had not refused to help. I had not argued. I had only asked a question that could not be answered without exposing everything that came before it. When the phone finally rang, it was not my daughter. It was her fiancé. His voice sounded controlled, almost rehearsed. "Can we meet? If you'd like. There have been misunderstandings." "I agree. We should clear the air. I'd like that." We arranged to meet at a quiet restaurant halfway between our homes. I arrived 10 minutes early, not to make a point, because I have always believed that arriving on time is a form of respect. He walked in carrying confidence that seemed carefully practiced. After we ordered coffee, he smiled politely. "I think this whole situation has gotten out of hand." "It has. I know you're upset." "I wouldn't use that word." He tilted his head. "What word would you use?" "Confused," he nodded slowly. "I understand." For a moment, I thought we might finally have an honest conversation. Then he continued. "You've misunderstood our intentions." There it was again, not our actions, my understanding. "I'd like to understand them." "You've always preferred giving us space." "I've respected your independence." "Exactly. Those aren't the same thing." He smiled patiently, the way people do when explaining something to a child. "I don't think anyone wanted you to feel excluded." I looked at him. "Then why was I?" His smile faded. "It wasn't intentional. The venue was booked 9 months ago." He remained silent. "The menu tasting happened months ago." Silence. "The guest list was finalized before I knew where the wedding would even take place." He folded his hands together. "Planning moved quickly. It moved for everyone except me." For the first time since we sat down, he had no immediate response. Instead, he reached for another explanation. "These things become complicated." "I'm sure they do. You know how stressful weddings are." "I do. We were trying to keep everyone happy." I nodded. "And the easiest way to do that was by leaving me out." He looked away, not because I had accused him, because I had removed every comfortable explanation one by one. When we left the restaurant, neither of us felt victorious. He thanked me for meeting him. I thanked him for the coffee. The conversation ended as politely as it had begun, yet nothing had been resolved. If anything, the distance between truth and explanation had become impossible to ignore. 2 days later, another unexpected call arrived, this time from my niece. "I think you should know something. I'm listening." There was a family group chat. I assumed there was. "I left it months ago." I waited. "They talked about how to explain your absence." I closed my eyes. "Explain it to whom?" "Everyone." She sounded embarrassed. "People kept asking why you weren't involved." "What did they say?" "They said you didn't want attention." I let out a slow breath. "The same story." "Yes." He hesitated. "There were other things." "What kind of things?" "They worried that if anyone asked you directly, the stories wouldn't match." For several seconds, neither of us spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, because the truth had become heavier than either of us expected. When we ended the call, I sat alone in my study. The room looked exactly as it always had, books neatly arranged, family photographs lining the shelves, my wife's old reading chair beside the window. Nothing had changed, except the way I now understood every quiet conversation I had missed. Later that evening, my sister came by. She placed a folder on the dining room table. "I wasn't sure whether to bring this." "What is it?" "Copies." "Of what?" "Emails." She sat down across from me. "I've been helping your aunt organize travel reservations." Inside the folder were printed email chains discussing seating arrangements, transportation, and payment deadlines. My name appeared only twice. First time someone asked whether I had confirmed attendance. The reply came less than 5 minutes later. "He prefers to stay in the background, don't pressure him." The second mention was even shorter. "We'll handle him separately." No one ever did. I looked at the pages without saying anything. My sister watched me carefully. "I thought you deserved to know." "Thank you. I should have spoken sooner." "You believed what everyone else believed." "I wanted to." She lowered her eyes. "It was easier." Honesty hurt less than the lies, because honesty asks for nothing except recognition. The following afternoon, my daughter finally called. Her voice sounded tired. "We need to settle this." "I agree. You've been talking to people." "No, they've been talking to me." Another silence. "They're making everything worse. I'm only answering questions. They think we're treating you badly." "I haven't told anyone that." "You didn't have to." Her words caught me off guard. For the first time, she sounded frightened. "Not of me, of the truth spreading without anyone controlling it." "I never wanted people taking sides," I said. "That's what's happening." "No," I answered gently. "People are comparing stories." She did not respond. "They're noticing the differences." Another long silence. Finally, she asked, "So, what happens now?" I looked through the kitchen window at the garden I had cared for every morning for years. Nothing there had ever grown overnight. Everything required patience, even difficult truths. "I don't know," I admitted. "I just know I can't pretend anymore." She whispered something I almost didn't hear. "We never meant for this." "I believe you." "You do." "I believe you never meant to face the consequences." She began crying softly, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for me to hear the weight she had been carrying. I wanted to comfort her. Every instinct told me to make things easier, to say none of it mattered, to offer the honeymoon money and restore the appearance of peace. Instead, I remained quiet, because peace built on denial is only another form of silence, and silence had already cost us enough. When we ended the call, I realized something irreversible had happened. No one was arguing about my memory anymore. No one was calling me confused. The conversation had shifted. Now everyone was trying to explain choices that had once been denied completely. The facts had not become louder. They had simply become impossible to ignore. People often imagine that heartbreak arrives like a storm. It does not, not always. Sometimes it settles quietly into the empty spaces of your day, into the chair that remains unoccupied, into the phone that no longer rings, into the realization that you have stopped expecting things to return to the way they were. That was where I found myself, not angry, not defeated, simply tired. For weeks, every conversation had revolved around facts, dates, emails, payments, witnesses. The truth had slowly surfaced on its own, exactly as I had hoped it would. Yet proving what happened did not bring the relief I imagined. It only confirmed what I had been trying not to believe. My daughter had not forgotten me. She had chosen, over and over again, to leave me outside the life she was building. That truth was far more painful than any lie. One afternoon, I visited the cemetery where my wife was buried. I had not been there in several weeks. I brought fresh flowers, cleaned a few fallen leaves from the stone, and sat quietly on the bench nearby. For years, this had been the place where I came whenever life became too heavy to carry alone. I never spoke aloud. I never expected answers. But sitting there always reminded me of the promises we had made to each other when our daughter was still small. We promised to give her stability. We promised to teach her kindness. We promised she would never have to wonder whether she was loved. I believed we had kept those promises, perhaps too well. Love given without conditions can sometimes be mistaken for love that asks for nothing in return. As I stood to leave, I realized I was no longer grieving the wedding. I was grieving the relationship. Missing one ceremony would eventually become a memory. Losing trust between a father and daughter was something far more permanent. A few days later, my daughter asked if she could come by. When she arrived, she looked exhausted. The confidence I had heard in her voice months earlier was gone. She stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "Can I come in?" "Of course." I made tea. We sat across from each other at the same dining table where I had helped her with school projects years ago. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, she looked at me. "I don't know how everything became so complicated," I answered honestly. "I think it became complicated when no one told the truth." She lowered her eyes. "We didn't think it would matter." "I know. It wasn't supposed to hurt you." "I know." Her eyes filled with tears. "Do you?" "I do." She looked surprised. "I believe you never woke up hoping to hurt me." "Then why can't we just move past it?" Because some questions deserve careful answers, I took my time before speaking. "You know the difference between an accident and a pattern?" She nodded faintly. "An accident happens once." I paused. "A pattern asks you to ignore it again and again." She looked down at her hands. "I never saw it that way." "I believe that." She began crying quietly, not because I had raised my voice. I never did, because for the first time, neither of us was hiding behind explanations. "I kept telling myself we'd fix it later," she whispered. "Later kept moving." She nodded. "I know." After a long silence, she reached into her bag and removed a folder. "I brought something." Inside were revised honeymoon plans, cheaper flights, a smaller hotel. Different dates. She looked at me carefully. "I wasn't coming to pressure you." I remained silent. "I wanted to ask one last time." There it was, not because she felt entitled, because somewhere inside her she still believed helping financially might repair what honesty had failed to protect. I closed the folder gently. "My answer hasn't changed." She nodded before I had even finished speaking. "I know. I won't pay for the honeymoon." More tears rolled down her face. "I understand." "I hope you believe this." She looked up. "This isn't punishment. I know. If I gave you the money today," I rested my hand on the folder, "everyone could pretend everything was fine," she whispered, "but it isn't." "No, it isn't." Another long silence settled between us. Then she asked the question I had been expecting for weeks. "Are you angry with me?" I thought carefully. "No." She looked confused. "I'm heartbroken." There is a difference. Anger wants someone to suffer. Heartbreak simply accepts that something precious has already been lost. She covered her face with both hands. "I'm so sorry." Those words mattered, not because they erased the past. Nothing could. They mattered because they were the first words that asked for no excuse, no explanation, no defense, only recognition. When she finally stood to leave, she hesitated at the front door. "I don't know how to fix this." I smiled sadly. "Neither do I," she nodded. Then she walked to her car and drove away. I stood on the porch until the street became quiet again. For the first time in months, I felt no desire to search for more evidence. No need to defend myself. The truth no longer required my help. It belonged to everyone now. Whether they accepted it or not was no longer my responsibility. That evening I placed every receipt, every printed email, every note, and every timeline back into the box where I had stored them. I closed the lid, not because the story was over, because I had reached the point where protecting my peace mattered more than proving my innocence. Some losses cannot be recovered. Some relationships cannot return to what they once were, but dignity survives when you refuse to purchase forgiveness at the price of your own self-respect. For the first time since the invitation had arrived, I stopped hoping someone would change the past. I chose to live honestly with what it had become. The wedding took place on a warm Saturday afternoon. I was not there. That sentence should have filled me with anger. Instead, it settled over me with a quiet sadness I had grown familiar with over the previous months. I did not spend the day wondering what the ceremony looked like. I did not imagine the flowers, the music, or the photographs. Those details belonged to people who had chosen to share that day with one another. I accepted that I was not one of them. That acceptance hurt, but it was honest. I spent the morning in my garden. The tomatoes needed tying to their stakes. A few weeds had pushed through after the week's rain. The work was simple, predictable. For a few hours, my hands stayed busy while my thoughts remained still. Around noon, my phone buzzed several times. I ignored it until I finished watering the last row of plants. When I finally looked, there were messages from relatives. None of them were dramatic, most were short. "I'm sorry. I didn't understand what had happened. I wish I had asked more questions." No one mentioned the ceremony itself. They did not need to. The messages were not about the wedding. They were about everything that had happened before it. One message came from my cousin. "People started asking where you were." I read it twice. Then another arrived. The stories didn't match anymore. That was all. No explanation, no details, just a quiet acknowledgement that the truth had finally reached the room without me ever entering it. Later that evening, my sister called. Her voice sounded tired. "How are you?" "I'm all right. I wanted you to hear this from me instead of someone else." I waited. "The honeymoon isn't happening." I remained silent. "They canceled Dubai." "Why?" "There wasn't enough money." I looked out the kitchen window. The sun was beginning to disappear behind the trees. "They thought someone would help at the last minute." "I see. They've changed the plans. I hope they still have a nice trip." My sister was quiet for several seconds. "I don't think that's what anyone expected you to say. I don't wish them unhappiness." "I know, and I meant it. There is a strange freedom that comes when you stop hoping consequences will satisfy you." Their canceled honeymoon did not undo the months of exclusion. It did not restore trust. It did not return the father and daughter relationship we once had. It was simply the natural result of expecting generosity without honesty. Nothing more. Over the following weeks, I heard small pieces of the story from different people. A guest had innocently asked why I wasn't walking my daughter down the aisle. No one answered immediately. Someone offered one explanation. Another guest quietly mentioned hearing something different. The conversation moved on, but the uncertainty remained. Later, a family friend remembered seeing me help pay for the engagement celebration. Another relative mentioned the wedding planner's confusion over the payment schedule. One by one, small facts connected with other small facts. No one held a meeting. No dramatic confrontation took place. There were no public accusations. There did not need to be. Truth has a patient way of introducing itself. It rarely arrives all at once. About a month after the wedding, I received a handwritten letter. The envelope was familiar. Inside was a single sheet of paper. My daughter had written every word by hand. She did not ask for money. She did not defend herself. She did not blame anyone else. She wrote that she had spent weeks replaying every conversation we had shared. She admitted that each small decision had seemed harmless at the time. One meeting without me. One conversation postponed. One assumption left uncorrected. One lie accepted because it felt easier than an uncomfortable truth. She wrote that none of those moments had seemed large enough to matter until they were placed together. Then she apologized, not for one mistake, for the pattern. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the same wooden box that now held the receipts, the emails, and the timeline. Not because I wanted to preserve the evidence, because the letter belonged with the story. It was the first page that did not require me to question what was real. Months passed. Our relationship did not magically return to what it had once been. Healing is slower than breaking, sometimes much slower. We spoke occasionally. Birthdays, holidays, short conversations. Each one felt careful, respectful, honest. Trust was no longer assumed. It was rebuilt a little at a time, through actions rather than promises. I learned something I wish I had understood years earlier. Love does not disappear when you set boundaries. If it disappears because you finally tell the truth, then it was never resting on love alone. One evening, as I locked the front door before bed, I noticed the wedding invitation still tucked inside the drawer of the hallway table. For a long time, I had wondered why I never threw it away. Then I realized it no longer reminded me of being excluded. It reminded me of the day I stopped confusing silence with peace. I placed it back inside the drawer and turned off the light. Some betrayals end with shouting. Some end in courtrooms. Mine ended much more quietly, with records instead of rumors, with witnesses instead of arguments, with consequences that arrived naturally without revenge. And with the understanding that dignity is not something another person gives you. It is something you protect, even when the people you love forget to.